The jar was the size of a man's fist. Amber glass, sealed with beeswax, and a square of oilcloth tied down with twine. Inside it were seeds, not a handful, not a scattering, but a dense, packed layer of seeds sorted by size, the smallest at the top and the largest at the bottom, separated by thin rounds of cheesecloth so they wouldn't crush each other. The label was written in ink on a strip of cotton adhesive tape pressed to the glass. Ardoin, Riz Rouge, Tolère Inondation, 1898 to 1938. Red rice, flood tolerant, 40 years of selection. The jar weighed almost nothing. It contained 4 decades of a dead woman's life. Vivienne Ardoin was holding it when her cousin Marcel pushed her suitcase off the porch and told her to leave. She was 16 years old, standing in bare feet on the crushed shell path in front of the house on Bayou Tigre, where she had lived since she was 9. And Marcel was standing on the porch with his wife Geneviève behind him, and his arms crossed in the way that men cross their arms when they've made a decision and don't intend to discuss it. "Ma mère left you the seeds," Marcel said. "She left me the house. The house is what matters. The seeds are what she left because she didn't have anything else to leave you, and she felt guilty about it. Take the seeds and go." Geneviève, who was the kind of woman who agreed with Marcel loudly when other people were present and silently when they weren't, nodded once. Vivienne looked at the jar in her hand, and the suitcase in the dirt, and the house behind Marcel. And she did not argue, because arguing with Marcel was like arguing with the Bayou. The water went where it wanted, regardless of what you said to it. She picked up the suitcase. It contained 2 dresses, a comb, a Bible with her mother's name written inside the front cover, and a pair of shoes she'd outgrown 6 months ago but kept because they were the only shoes she had. The jar she put in the pocket of her skirt, where it sat against her hip like a heartbeat, heavy and warm from her hand. She walked down the shell path to the road and turned south toward Petit Chenière, which was 3 miles away, and was where her great-grandmother Celestine had lived, on a piece of land that Marcel had not mentioned because Marcel did not know about it, and which Vivienne knew about only because Celestine had told her about it in the last week of her life, whispering from a bed she would never leave. The cottage on the Chenière, it's still mine. The seeds in the cellar, they're still mine. When they put you out, and they will put you out, child, go there. Everything I saved is there. Celestine Ardoin had died on February 14th, 1940, at the age of 87, in the back bedroom of the house on Bayou Tigre that she had built with her husband Alcide in 1882, and that Marcel now owned because Celestine had left it to him in the will. And Celestine had left it to him because Marcel was the oldest surviving male grandchild, and that was how things were done in Vermilion Parish, and Celestine had not been a woman who fought tradition when tradition had a use. What she had fought was the Bayou itself, its floods, its salt intrusions, its habit of drowning everything people planted and then retreating as if nothing had happened. She had fought it with seeds. For 40 years, from 1898 to 1938. She had collected, bred, selected, and preserved seed varieties that could survive what the Bayou did to ordinary crops. She crossed rice varieties that drowned in 3 inches of standing water with varieties that survived in 6. She selected okra that could germinate in salt-contaminated soil. She bred field peas that matured in 60 days instead of 90, so they could be harvested before the fall floods arrived. She gathered medicinal herbs, sassafras, elderberry, boneset, mullein, and learned which ones grew on high ground and which ones grew in the wet. And then she dried them and stored them and wrote down what each one did in a series of notebooks that she kept in a leather satchel under her bed. The parish called her the Jar Woman. She had jars everywhere, on shelves, in crates, in a cypress root cellar she'd built on the Chenière. on a raised platform of bald cypress posts sunk 4 feet into the shell ridge so the floor sat 6 feet above the high water mark of the worst flood in living memory. The root cellar was 8 feet by 12, lined with cypress planks, ventilated by screened gaps in the eaves, and it contained, as Vivian would discover, over 300 jars of seeds, each one labeled in Celestine's careful hand with the variety name, the year of first selection, the year of most recent harvest, the flood tolerance rating, and the growing season in days. And 300 jars, 40 years. The most complete collection of flood-adapted seed stock in southern Louisiana, and nobody in the parish knew it existed except Celestine, Tante Odile, and now Vivienne. Stay with me, because what Celestine built in that root cellar over 4 decades, and what happened when the water came and destroyed everything else, is the reason people in Vermilion Parish still grow red rice they call Ardoin seed. Vivienne's mother, Rose, had died of typhoid in 1933. Her father, Celestine's grandson, a man named Louis, had drowned in Bayou the same year, pulled under by a current while checking crawfish traps on a night when he should not have been on the water, and everyone knew it. But nobody said it because speaking ill of a drowned man in Bayou country is bad luck, and the Bayou has enough bad luck without adding to it. Vivienne went to live with Marcel because Marcel was family, and family took you in. Marcel took her in the way a man takes in a stray, with a roof and a meal and no particular affection. Genevieve tolerated her. The children ignored her. Celestine, who was 80 when Vivienne arrived, was the only person in the household who looked at her as if she were something more than an obligation. Celestine taught Vivienne to read seeds the way Elka read granite and Delia read ash. She taught her that a seed is not a dead thing, it is a sleeping thing, and the difference between dead and sleeping is everything. She taught her to sort by weight, by color, by the shape of the hull, because each of those tells you something about what the seed will become. She taught her that flood tolerance is not a single trait, but a combination: root depth, stem flexibility, leaf angle, germination speed. And that 40 years of selection had given Celestine varieties that could do what no store-bought seed could do: survive standing water for 10 days and still produce. She taught her that the jar is not the collection. The jar is the library. The seed is the book. The plant is the story. And the harvest is the reader. Vivienne understood. She understood because she had Celestine's hands, small, precise, patient, and Celestine's eyes, which saw the difference between a seed that was sleeping and a seed that was dead, and knew that the difference mattered. The cottage on the Cheniere was small, sound, and built to survive. Creole construction, bousillage walls, mud and Spanish moss between cypress timbers, a raised floor on cypress piers, a gallery porch on 3 sides, a steep pitched roof to shed rain. The Cheniere itself was a low ridge of shell and sand rising 4 feet above the surrounding marsh. Not much elevation. But in Bayou country, 4 feet is the difference between dry and drowned. Live oaks grew on the ridge, their branches draped with Spanish moss, their roots holding the shell together the way the bur oaks held the sinkhole rim in Wisconsin. The cottage had 1 main room, a sleeping alcove, a cook stove, and a plank table scarred with 40 years of knife marks from Celestine cutting herbs. The walls smelled like dried sassafras and beeswax. The floor was cypress plank, swept smooth from decades of bare feet. On a shelf beside the stove sat a row of jars, 15 of them, each one labeled, each one containing seeds. But these were not the collection. These were what Celestine had kept in the house for daily use. The collection was elsewhere. The root cellar sat behind the cottage, its cypress posts driven deep into the shell, its floor 6 feet above the marsh. Celestine had built it in 1904 with Alcide before he died, and she'd been filling it ever since. The structure itself was a testament to Celestine's understanding of the Bayou. Not just what the water did to crops, but what the water did to buildings. She'd used bald cypress for every structural member because bald cypress is naturally resistant to rot and termite. And she'd treated the posts with a tar and linseed oil mixture she'd cooked herself from a recipe in one of Alcide's shipbuilding manuals. The ventilation was designed to prevent moisture buildup inside. Screened gaps in the eaves drew hot air upward and out, creating a convective current that kept the interior cool and dry, even in the August heat when the air outside was 95 degrees and 100% humidity. The door faced east, away from the prevailing storm winds. And the lock was brass because iron rusts in Bayou air, and Celestine did not build things that rusted. If you're enjoying this story, consider subscribing. Here we share stories like this every week. Ordinary people who found extraordinary things in the places the world gave up on. Vivienne opened the root cellar on her 3rd day at the cottage. The door was cypress, heavy, fitted with a hasp and a padlock that Celestine had given her the key to, along with a jar of red rice. The key was brass, small, warm from Vivienne's pocket. The lock turned with a click that sounded like a sentence beginning. Inside, shelves, floor to ceiling, both walls, double deep. 314 jars, amber glass, green glass, clear glass, each one sealed with beeswax and oilcloth, each one labeled in cotton tape with Celestine's handwriting. Red rice, white rice, brown rice. Purple hull peas, Crowder peas, lady cream peas. Okra, 3 varieties. Clemson spineless adapted for salt. A dwarf variety that matured in 52 days, and a tall variety that produced until frost. Merleton seeds saved from a vine that had been growing on the same trellis since 1907. Cayenne pepper seeds. Shallot bulbs wrapped in cheesecloth. Dried sassafras root in jars. Elderberry seeds. Bundles of dried boneset and mullein hanging from the ceiling joists. And on a shelf by itself, in a wooden box lined with cotton, 4 notebooks, Celestine's notebooks, each one dated by decade. 1898 to 1908, 1908 to 1918, 1918 to 1928, 1928 to 1938. Vivienne sat on the cellar floor with a jar in each hand and cried. Not from grief, from scale. Celestine had built a library of life inside a cypress box on stilts, and she'd done it alone for 40 years, while the parish called her the jar woman, and her own grandson called the seeds worthless. Or 314 jars. Each jar was a variety. Each variety was a solution to a problem the Bayou would ask again. The collection wasn't just seeds. It was answers, stored in glass, waiting for the questions. Tante Odile Broussard appeared at the cottage on a morning in April, walking up the shell ridge from the Bayou Road with a basket on her arm, and a tignon wrapped around her white hair so precisely it looked structural. She was 79 years old, Creole, with gold hoop earrings that caught the light when she turned her head, and hands so gnarled from decades of root work and herb gathering that they looked like the roots themselves. She had been a traiteur, a folk healer, for 50 years, treating fevers with boneset tea, drawing infection with poultices, delivering babies in houses with no doctors within 30 miles. She'd known Celestine since 1889. She was the only person in the parish who'd been inside the root cellar besides Celestine and Vivienne. Her first words were, "Celestine told me to give you 1 planting season and then come see if you knew what you had. You don't know yet, but you will. I brought andouille." She set the basket on the gallery table and didn't wait for an invitation. Odile knew things the notebooks didn't record. She knew which varieties Celestine had stopped selecting because they were already perfect, and which ones she was still working on when she died. She knew that the red rice, the riz rouge in the amber jar, was Celestine's masterpiece. A variety crossed over 37 generations from a Carolina gold parent, and a wild red rice collected from a Bayou bank in 1898 that could produce 60 bushels per acre in standing water that would kill any commercial variety. She knew that the okra varieties were drought-resistant as well as salt-tolerant, because Celestine had selected for root depth on the cheniere where the water table dropped in August. She knew that the medicinal herbs were not separate from the food crops. They were part of the same system, planted at the edges of the growing beds to repel insects, attract pollinators, and provide remedies for the fevers and parasites that the Bayou delivered along with its floods. Together, they planted. Vivienne followed Celestine's notebooks. Planting calendars mapped to the Bayou's flood cycle, showing which varieties to plant, when, at what depth, at what spacing, to maximize the harvest window between the spring high water and the fall hurricane season. The calendars were not simple. They accounted for soil temperature, moon phase, prevailing wind direction, and something Celestine called the Bayou's mood, which was her term for the complex interaction of tide, rainfall, and upstream runoff that determined whether the water table on the cheniere was 6 inches below the surface or 2 feet. Planting on a falling water table was different from planting on a rising one. Celestine had figured this out by observation, not by reading. She had no formal education past the 3rd grade, but she had 40 years of watching what happened to seeds in wet ground, and she had written it all down in a notation system that was part French, part English, and part a private shorthand that took Vivienne 3 weeks to decode. The red rice went in first, in March, in beds raised 8 inches above the surrounding soil on berms of shell and clay that Celestine had designed to shed water during heavy rain, but retain moisture during the dry weeks of June. The beds were oriented north to south to maximize sunlight exposure across both sides, and they were spaced 3 feet apart to allow walking between them for harvest and weeding. The peas went in behind the rice, planted in the rice stubble after the first rice harvest, using the residual nitrogen the rice roots had fixed in the soil. And this was companion planting on a seasonal scale, and Celestine had calibrated it to the week. Rice out by August 20th, peas in by August 25th, peas out by October 15th, before the hurricane season peaked. The okra went in last, in May, because okra needs warm soil, at least 65 degrees at the 4-inch depth. And the Bayou country doesn't deliver warm soil until the mosquitoes arrive, which is the Bayou's way of making you pay for everything it gives you. Vivienne planted all 3 okra varieties. The Clemson Spineless, adapted for salt soil along the lower edge of the cheniere, where salt intrusion from the marsh was highest. The dwarf variety along the gallery porch for quick harvest, and the tall variety in the center of the plot, where it could grow 6 feet and produce until frost. By June, the cottage plot was dense, a 1/4 acre of staggered planting that looked random to anyone walking past, but was calculated to the week, each variety occupying a layer and a time slot in a system that Celestine had spent 40 years calibrating. The harvest came fast. Red rice in August, heavy heads bending the stalks, the grain a deep reddish brown that looked like polished wood. 40 pounds from a 1/4 acre, more than Vivienne could eat in a year. And that was from seed stock she'd planted from a single jar. She saved 1/3 of the harvest as next year's seed. The heaviest heads, the straightest stalks, the ones that had stood tallest when the June rain flooded the beds for 3 days and every commercial rice field in the parish had drowned. Selection was the heart of the system. You didn't save seed randomly. You saved the survivors. You saved the ones that proved they could do what you needed. Every generation of saved seed was stronger than the last because every generation was the offspring of the best performers under the worst conditions. That was what 40 years of selection meant. Not just one woman's patience, but 40 generations of rice. Each one slightly more flood-proof than the one before. Each one carrying the memory of every flood Celestine had tested it against. She dried the seed rice on screens in the gallery shade and packed it into new jars with beeswax seals, following Celestine's method exactly. The okra produced until October. The peas produced twice, a spring crop and a fall crop planted in the rice stubble. She sold surplus at the Crossroads store in Petit Chenier. The storekeeper, a man named Boudreau, looked at the red rice and said, "Where'd you get this?" Vivian said, "My great-grandmother grew it." Boudreau said, "Your great-grandmother was the jar woman." Vivian said, "Yes, and the jars are why you're holding rice." Everything was about to fall apart. Because while Vivian was harvesting the last of the okra, something was building upstream that would test Celestine's 40 years of work. A wall of water that would flatten every field in Vermilion Parish and leave the soil so salt-poisoned that nothing store-bought would grow in it for 2 seasons. And the only seed stock in the entire parish that could survive what was coming was sitting in 314 jars on a cypress platform 6 feet above the high water mark. The flood came on October 17th, 1940. A hurricane pushed a storm surge up the bayous from the Gulf. And the rain that fell behind it, 11 inches in 36 hours, had nowhere to go because the bayous were already full. The water rose. It rose past the marsh. It rose past the fields. It rose past the porches of the houses built on low ground, which was most of the houses in the parish. It rose to levels that no one alive had seen. 4 feet above the previous high water mark, which had stood as the worst flood in memory since 1918. The water was brown and salt-contaminated from the storm's surge, and it carried with it everything the bayou had collected on the way up. Mud, debris, dead animals, fuel oil from overturned tanks, and salt. The salt was the worst. A freshwater flood recedes and the soil recovers. A saltwater flood poisons the ground. Salt in the soil kills roots, changes the chemistry, prevents germination. A field that floods with salt water doesn't just lose this year's crop. It loses next year's crop and the year after that, until rain and time flush the salt out, which can take 2 to 5 years depending on the soil type. Every field in the parish went under. Every seed stock, the bins of rice, the sacks of peas, the boxes of okra seed that farmers kept in barns and sheds, was either washed away or soaked in salt water and ruined. The commercial seed suppliers in Crowley and Lafayette were flooded themselves. There would be no replacement stock before spring. The parish had no food, no seed, and no way to grow either one in soil that was poisoned with salt. But on the Chenier, the water had risen to 4 feet. The cottage floor, raised on cypress piers, sat at 4.5 feet. The root cellar floor sat at 6 feet. The water licked the bottom of the cellar posts and went no higher. The 314 jars sat on their shelves, dry, sealed, untouched. Celestine had built the cellar to survive the worst flood she could imagine. And she had imagined correctly. Because Celestine had lived through the flood of 1918 and the flood of 1926 and had measured the high water marks at the way Einar measured sinkhole levels. With notches in wood, dated and labeled, creating a flood gauge that went back 40 years. She had set the cellar floor 12 inches above the highest mark. The 1940 flood exceeded every mark by 6 inches. The cellar still cleared by 6 inches. 12 inches of margin had saved 40 years of seed. They came in November, and when the water receded and the damage became visible, and the full scale of the loss settled over the parish like a second flood. Farmers, fishermen, families who had lost their houses and their gardens and their seed corn and their rice stock. They came to the Cheniere because word had spread the way it spreads in Bayou country. Not through newspapers or radios, but through boats. A fisherman named Thibodeau had passed the Cheniere on his way to check his traps and seen the root cellar standing above the waterline, and told his brother-in-law, who told the postmaster, who told everyone. Marcel came. He came in a borrowed pirogue because his truck was flooded, and he stood on the shell ridge looking at the root cellar he hadn't known existed, and the cottage he hadn't known Celestine owned, and the seed jars he had called worthless 4 months earlier. And he looked at Vivienne the way the county assessor had looked at Rena in the tunnel, and Dale had looked at Sigrid on the ridge, and Delbert had looked at Margit in the sinkhole. Like a man who had just realized that the thing he'd thrown away was the only thing that mattered. That moment, Marcel standing on the shell ridge with mud on his boots and an empty pirogue behind him and 300 jars of seeds in front of him, changed everything. And every person who had called Celestine the jar woman would spend the next 2 years growing food from the jars she had filled. Vivienne gave seed. She didn't sell it, didn't trade it, you didn't hold it over anyone. She opened the cellar and she let them in, and she stood at the shelves and explained each variety the way Celestine had explained them to her. What it tolerated, when to plant it, how deep, how far apart. She gave Marcel red rice. She gave Thibodeau okra. She gave the schoolteacher salt-tolerant pea seed. She gave Boudreau enough to stock the Crossroads store with seed packets measured out by the cup into brown paper bags, with the variety name and planting instructions written in Vivienne's hand. She saved enough of each variety to replant the cottage plot and maintain the collection. This was Celestine's first rule, written on the inside cover of notebook number 1. Never give away the last jar. The last jar is the future. Everything else is this year. Odile stood on the gallery porch with her arms folded and watched Vivienne distribute seed to 60 families and said, Celestine would have done it the same way, except Celestine would have charged for the enduit. Marcel came back alone in December. He stood at the root cellar door and looked at the shelves, still more than half full, because 314 varieties is a vast number, and 60 families only needed a fraction of it. He said, Mère tried to show me the cellar, twice. I said I didn't have time for jars. Vivienne was sorting seed on the gallery table, separating the heaviest rice grains for next year's planting stock. She said, I know, she told me. Marcel said, I told you the seeds were what she left because she didn't have anything else. I was wrong, and the seeds were everything. The house is just boards. Vivienne set down the rice. The house kept you dry, she said. The seeds will keep you fed. She gave us both what we needed. She just knew which one mattered more. Marcel stood there for a long time. Then he said, I'm sorry I put your suitcase in the dirt. Vivienne said, The dirt is where the seeds go. Maybe that's where the suitcase needed to be too. She handed him a jar of early maturing peas. He took it with both hands. In Bayou country, taking something with both hands means you understand what it weighs. A man came in the spring of 1941. Remy Guidry, a rice farmer from Rain whose family had grown commercial rice for 3 generations and lost every grain in the flood. He came because Boudreau had told him about the red rice. And when he didn't believe it, a rice variety that could produce in salt-contaminated soil sounded like a lie or a miracle, and Remy didn't believe in either one. He arrived skeptical. He left carrying a jar. He stayed because he watched Vivian plant a rice bed on salt-damaged ground that every agricultural extension agent in the state would have said was useless for 2 more years. And he watched the red rice germinate in 7 days and stand 8 inches tall in 3 weeks in soil that killed his commercial seed. He said, "How long did your great-grandmother work on this?" Vivian said, 37 years for the rice, 40 for the collection. Remy said, "I spent 3 generations growing someone else's seed and lost it in 1 night. She spent 40 years growing her own, and it survived everything." He had careful hands and a way of looking at rice that told Vivian he understood what it meant to hold 40 years of selection in a jar. They married in the fall of 1941 in the cottage on the Cheniere, with Odile as witness and the sound of the Bayou at evening tide and the smell of cypress and salt air and the faint, warm scent of beeswax from 300 jars on shelves behind them. The parish recovered, but it recovered on Celestine's seed. The commercial varieties that the agricultural suppliers pushed, the ones bred for yield and uniformity and nothing else, failed in the salt-damaged soil for 2 years, exactly as Vivian had warned. Celestine's variety succeeded because Celestine had bred them for survival, not yield. They didn't produce as much per acre, and they didn't look as uniform. They didn't match the pictures in the seed catalogs. But they grew in soil that killed everything else. And in 1940, that was the only trait that mattered. Odile died in the summer of 1947, 86 years old, sitting in a cane chair on the gallery of the cottage with a bundle of dried sassafras in her lap and a cup of coffee on the railing. She asked to be buried on the Cheniere, under the live oaks, where the shell ridge kept the water out, and the Spanish moss moved in the breeze like slow hands. Vivienne and Remy dug the grave in shell and sand that smelled like the Bayou and the Gulf, and the 400 years of people who had lived on these ridges, because the ridges were the only dry ground in a world made of water. Vivienne put Odile's gold hoop earrings on the headstone. They're still there, a tarnished green but catching the light when the angle is right. The Louisiana State University Extension Service came in 1949. A team from the Rice Research Station in Crowley, who had heard about the Ardoin red rice and wanted to evaluate it formally. They tested it for yield, salt tolerance, flood tolerance, grain quality, and disease resistance. The lead agronomist, a woman named Dr. Corinne Melançon, said the salt tolerance was extraordinary. This variety exhibits a sodium exclusion mechanism that we have not documented in any commercially available rice cultivar. She asked where the variety had come from. Vivienne showed her the notebooks. Dr. Melançon read them sitting on the gallery porch with her shoes off and her feet on the railing and her mouth slightly open. She said, "Your great-grandmother conducted a 40-year breeding program in her backyard that produced results the LSU rice station hasn't matched with modern equipment." Vivienne said, "She didn't have modern equipment. She had jars." Dr. Melançon published a paper. She credited Celestine Ardoin on the first page. Vivienne checked the spelling of Ardoin 3 times because the French spelling mattered, and Celestine would have cared. Remy built the seed program into a parish-wide cooperative that distributed Celestine's varieties to families who wanted flood-adapted stock. He died in 1979 in the cottage, in the cypress frame bed that Celestine had slept in, and Vivienne had slept in, and their daughter had been born in. Vivienne buried him beside Odile on the Cheniere. Their daughter took over the collection. As their granddaughter learned to read the notebooks. The root cellar still stands. The jars are still sealed. The red rice is still growing in Vermilion Parish, and the people who grow it still call it Ardoin seed, because the name matters, and the name carries 40 years of a woman kneeling in Bayou mud, selecting the heaviest heads from the tallest stalks in the deepest water. And that work doesn't get a catalog number. It gets a name. If this story stayed with you, If the idea that a jar of seeds saved on a shelf can outlast a hurricane and feed a parish means something to you, subscribe for more. We'll see you in the next one.